Hi everybody, welcome back to Between the Lines. My name's Julian, I'm an obsessive reader and used book collector, and welcome to my first video of 2022. 2021 was kind of a mess, and it was a year that there's lots to talk about, lots happened, and the world is crazy and still crazy, but why not put 2021 to rest finally by kind of wrapping it up and talking about the top 5 books I read in that year. So let's get into it. So this list is going to be insanely subjective. I know there's going to be some choices on here where people may consider, especially books that are within larger series, that there may be better books in those series, but I'm going to be putting my choices as the ones that resonated with me the most. And while technically there may be better written books in these series, I'm just going to put the ones that I had the best time with. Speaking of books within larger series, I am going to limit each series to having one book in my top 5 list. There are a couple of books here that maybe could have squeaked in that are part of the same series, but just to be fair to all the books I read last year, I'll only let one from each series be in the top 5. I will talk some honorable mentions before I get to number 1, so you'll see some more from those series pop up there, but my rule going forward today is one from each series and that's it. Alright, so let's get started with it. Let's start with number 5 here, and this is a book I really enjoyed and kind of saved a series for me, and that's Deadbeat by Jim Butcher, which is book 7 in the Dresden Files. Coming into book 7, I was a little down on the Dresden Files. A lot of people know, especially if you've read this series, that books 1 to 6 are a little rocky. There's some good entries, there's some less good entries, but by book 7 it really picks up, and that's where it kind of had a shift and became the Dresden Files that I absolutely love today. Book 6 was a bit of a downer for me. Blood Rights was really just very basic and formulaic and didn't really offer anything new outside of giving more details into the White Court of Vampires, and I was a little like especially coming after Death Masks, which was also just okay and probably had my least favorite villain in the series up until when that villain was redeemed in a later book for me. But I heard that the series really started picking up at book 7, and the hype definitely was not lying. Considering it's the one that made it onto my top 5, which means it's the one from the Dresden Files that I'm picking to put on this list. There are some other Dresden Files books that come really close and may, like I said before, be technically better books, but Deadbeat I just had such an amazing time with. It had the best blend to me of that mystery noir vibe that the series started out with and kind of abandoned a little as it went along, but blending it with the fantasy and magic elements. And this one deals a lot with necromancy and zombies, and I thought that was a really cool aspect to have in the Dresden Files and felt very organic to be in there. This one may have also been the funniest of the books too, and had some of the best character moments that I remember over the course of the books. And I don't want to spoil anything, but if you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about. And the character who says Poco will never die, that was just such a brilliant and amazing moment. And speaking of moments, this book had plenty of them that paid off so well, so many twists and turns, and the climactic final act of this book was not the biggest in the series, but definitely one of the most fun and the one I enjoyed probably the most. So Deadbeat, you did a great job. You saved a series for me, and I'm so happy I continued on with the books after that, because the Dresden Files from book 7 on have just been incredible. Alright, so coming in at number 4, we have Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This one was a no-brainer to put on my list. This book is a classic that so many people love and has clearly been so influential on literature and media, especially movies. Coming into reading Frankenstein, I was very aware of how different it was going to be compared to the movie adaptations. I've seen a whole bunch of them, and I'm very familiar with the original version from the 1930s with Boris Karloff, and I knew that it took a lot of liberties with the material. So going into the book, I wasn't going to be too taken aback by that, and I really wasn't. I was more curious to see what the changes were and maybe why they made those changes in the movie. The book itself focuses more on the philosophy of who Victor is as a person and the philosophy of the monster and him trying to be a human and him dealing with the repercussions of being treated not like a human. While the movie focuses more on the actual creation aspect of the monster and the fallout from that, I really appreciated how the book focused more on the humanity of the characters rather than just the science. I read this book in October, which was the perfect time to read it, and I enjoyed it so much. I was balancing a couple of other books at that time because I kind of needed to rush to get into Rebel's Creed by Daniel Green in order to get my review out on time for the book release. But despite that, I had a great time with this book. And after this, I wanted to watch the adaptation that was made by Kenneth Branagh in the 90s. That was more of a faithful adaptation to the book. And that movie was just whack. I am not a fan of that movie. It is so weird. Like, they tried to do some sort of avant-garde experimental filmmaking techniques, which I don't think at the time Branagh was an experienced enough director to really handle. He certainly made some better movies since then, but as it goes for an adaptation of Frankenstein, it may have been the most literal adaptation and most faithful, but a weird movie that I probably won't watch ever again. Coming in at number 3, we have Wizard and Glass by Stephen King. So this is part of the Dark Tower series. It is book 4 in the series, but it stands out as a part of the series as it doesn't really advance the story all that much that books 1, 2, and 3 had been driving. It's more flashback focused. I would say probably like 90% of this book is about the main character's backstory and why he is the way he is. But this may be the best written book in the series. It had such a beautiful, tragic story and is a genre that I wasn't really too familiar with. It was a blend of Western, fantasy, and romance. I don't read a whole lot of romance, but the way it was handled in this book I thought was really beautiful and tragic, and it was such a well-developed organic story where all the pieces just kind of fell into place and nothing ever felt too contrived or forced, and the world felt so alive and rich. The town that it took place in felt like a real place despite the fantasy aspects. And this one I think was the biggest in the series up until the final book, and it took me a little while to get through just because it was so long, but I enjoyed every minute of it. And even outside the self-contained flashback section, the part at the beginning where it starts off wrapping up the cliffhanger from book 3, and then the part at the end where more information is given about the main character, was such a nice package, all neatly tied up. And this has honestly piqued my interest more into the Western genre, just kind of as it is. I'm planning on reading Lonesome Dove at some point, which is a book I've heard great things about. It is super long from what it looks like, so I'll have to set aside some time for that, but I'm looking forward to it. And Wizard and Glass just changed the way I thought about Stephen King books, honestly. Up until then, I had read plenty of his classics and was kind of soured a bit by It. That was a book I didn't respond to like many other people have who consider it, you know, a masterpiece or a classic. So coming back into the Dark Tower, and by the time I got to Wizard and Glass, I really started to value Stephen King as an excellent writer with a real knack for organic storytelling. Coming in at number 2, we have To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. I know a lot of people probably read this in school. I never got the opportunity to do so, but I've heard about it just from cultural osmosis of being a person in this day and age. But I finally picked it up at 2021. I wanted to make that dive and read this classic that so many people have talked about, and there's a reason why this book was taught to so many people and is still talked about to this day. This was such a beautiful, amazing book, and I'm shocked at how relevant and how some of these problems still persist to this day, and how real and tragic the story was in this. And I think it had the perfect blend of having that social commentary, talking about real issues that are affecting real people, but also making it a really beautiful, well-told story with high stakes and well-drawn characters, and a final act that had a bit of tension to it, which I wasn't expecting, but thought it fit in well with the story that was being told. And of course, now I understand why so many people love Atticus Finch, and I believe that some people's opinions of Atticus Finch have been soured by the sequel that was released. I don't plan on reading that, so just taking his character as it exists in To Kill a Mockingbird, he is such a well-drawn character that I really enjoyed spending time with, and the way he acts as a father, as a lawyer, and just as a citizen was really interesting to see. And this is a book I took so much away from and was really sad that I had never read it in my formative reading years. So before we get into my number 1, I wanted to talk about some honorable mentions, some books that were also part of those series I mentioned here that just didn't make the top 5, and some others I just had a really fun time with. And going in with Dresden, I gotta say Turncoat, Changes, and Cold Days really stood out to me as really great books. Turncoat had a really captivating mystery that I liked seeing, and a sort of almost buddy cop, unlikely pair situation that I wasn't expecting, and had a really great time with. It was a really fun book, but also felt super high stakes and had a very dangerous villain in it. Changes, of course, was just insane. If you've read Changes, you know what I'm talking about. I don't need to describe it to you. But if you haven't, this is the book in the Dresden Files. This is book 12, where everything completely gets messed up. Dresden's whole life is upended and crazy things are just happening. And if you've been reading up to that point, it feels like everything, all the story threads almost that were leading up to there, get addressed in this book, and the series is just never the same from there. I can't decide though whether at this point Battleground kind of shook the universe more than Changes or not. The stakes were certainly higher in Battleground on a just, you know, physical world level, but Changes for me was just, from the first line of that book, I went, what the f***? Cold Days was also an excellent entry in the series. It definitely wasn't the highest stakes, but I really enjoyed the story there, especially getting more into the fairy courts and winter especially. I thought it had a really interesting hook, and the goal that Harry set out to accomplish, especially taking on his new role in the world and what that means to his character and the people around him, and especially bouncing back after the events of Changes and the sort of alternative take it took in Ghost Story. Also, from another series on my list, we have The Drawing of the Three, which is book 2 in the Dark Tower. This was a crazy book, a roller coaster from beginning to end. It just started right off the first page with action and weird, crazy nonsense and just never let up until the end. I had so much fun with this book. And coming into the end of The Drawing of the Three, when I was on the last couple pages, it really cemented to me like, wow, the Dark Tower is really something cool. The Gunslinger is an interesting and cool alternative kind of weird book, but The Drawing of the Three made me realize, the Dark Tower is some cool stuff. And then from there, going on and getting to Wizarding Glass and realizing that King was an absolute master of his craft, The Dark Tower is just so good. If you're into weird alternative fantasy, western genre blending, I'd highly recommend it. My next honorable mention is Foundation and Empire, the second book in the Foundation trilogy, the original trilogy written by Isaac Asimov. And this book was really good, and it may be the only book I read last year that I didn't really like when I was reading it, up until the very end and then after I finished the book. It had a very weak first half, but setting that up as a weak story point and then having the second half of the book, which was a separate story, really made sense thematically, and I thought it was a really brave move on part of Asimov to kind of have a weak first half in order to thematically set up the second half. And as a whole, that book makes a lot more sense when you consider the two together, and I really appreciate what he did. My next honorable mention is The Master and Margarita. This is a Russian classic that a lot of people know about. I finally read it this year in March. I'm no stranger to Russian literature, but The Master and Margarita was something I totally almost wasn't ready for and wasn't expecting. It is super weird. The devil arrives in Moscow and starts messing with people's lives, and it's so crazy. I can't even begin to describe it here, but again, like The Dark Tower, if you're into strange, unusual books with plots that are unexpected, I would definitely go for this. And the last of my honorable mentions is a tie between two books, and that being The Eye of the World and The Great Hunt by Robert Jordan. These are book 1 and 2 of The Wheel of Time, a series that I started this year and I'm enjoying quite a bit. I'm gonna start reading book 3 in the next couple of weeks and can't wait to do it. I've really enjoyed The Wheel of Time so far, and learning about the hype and why so many people love this series has just been such a treat. And it's an absolutely fascinating world and can't wait to learn more about it. So hopefully in the next week or so, I'll start book 3, The Dragon Reborn, and talk about my thoughts here. And I couldn't decide which of these books I liked more. I think maybe The Eye of the World was more of a balanced book, beginning to end. It was, quality, good pacing throughout. But The Great Hunt had a bit of a slow first half that wasn't as good as the first book in my mind, but the second half really made up for it, and it was crazy and action-packed and had a lot of twists and turns I wasn't expecting, so it made up for it with that. So I can't really decide which I like better at this point, so that's why both of them are here. All right, so now we come to number 1. What was the book I thought was the best that I read in 2021? And that book is Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. I didn't plan to read this or anything. One day my sister came up to me and handed me a book and said, "Hey, have you read Fahrenheit 451?" And I said, "No." And then she said, "Oh, well, here it is." And then I looked at the book and it was Slaughterhouse-Five. I didn't expect to read it. Fahrenheit 451 is a book that is still on my TBR, and I'm going to read very soon. But I said, okay, you know, Slaughterhouse-Five, I've heard of it. You know, it's a famous novel, Kurt Vonnegut, I've never read before. I might as well check it out. So I immediately sat down and started reading it, and this book blew me away. It is a blend of witty, you know, science fiction, satire, very black humor, and some absolute dark, horrific memories and moments that take place during the Second World War. And it was a book that really moved me, you know, seeing those scenes of what a person experienced in a prison camp in World War II and as a soldier during that time in the winter, and then blending it with these weird sci-fi concepts and jumping around between different time periods was something I wasn't ready for, but was absolutely blown away by. And the message of this story coming out so clear to me about the futility of war and how brutal and horrific it can be, and seeing it through the author's eyes in this almost semi-autobiographical method of doing so. And I'm definitely going to get into more Vonnegut after this, because this book was just something else and definitely number one on my list. So that's it for my top 5. Let me know in the comments if you've read any of these books and what you thought. Do you agree with me in some of the choices I made in, you know, deciding which of the series to put on this list? And what's your top 5? If you want to leave it down in the comments, go ahead. I'd really love to know what you all read last year and what you consider in your 5 best books. So that's it for now. Remember to do all the YouTube stuff like liking and subscribing. And as always, thank you for watching. Please remember to support your local library, and I'll see you next time.